everyone. My name is Kaspar. I'll be moderating this panel. Thank you so much for joining us. We got the graveyard shift in a way, so I'm surprised that everyone's still alive and awake. We'll have about an hour to discuss what better topic to keep us awake than violence and abuse online. So hopefully that will keep us going for an hour. I have with me a distinguished panel who will help pitch in. The name of our session this evening is iRadical, Countering Online Hate and Violence. Over the last day and a half, we've had a chance to participate in a number of sessions that have touched upon, among other things, how digital technologies are shaping our lives in the 21st century for better or worse. Now, what this session, what we've heard is that on the one hand, free, open, and secure internet can be a powerful tool to promote democracy, connectivity, enhance social inclusiveness, foster economic growth. But on the other hand, it is also not immune from abuse. Now, we'll be talking about the latter in this session, and what we'll focus on here is looking at how digital platforms in particular can be used by bad actors to foment and incite hatred and violence. We will focus particularly on actions by terrorist and violent extremist actors and harmful online content that is usually classified as terrorist or extremist. Now, I say this because, as we'll see, and as conversation just before the panel already showed me, there are different types of content that can be conflated with these issues. And I think when we talk about solutions, it's important to be specific. But we'll get to that in the course of the conversation. Now, one of the examples of the problem that we're dealing with here came to the fore last year. You'll remember in March there was an attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, on a Muslim community where an attacker used Facebook Live, which is a live streaming function on Facebook's platform, to broadcast the attacks as they were happening. At the time, fewer than 200 people actually watched the live stream, and Facebook actually removed it within minutes as it found out that this was happening. But over 1.5 million attempts were recorded of people trying to share and upload the video afterwards, and only on Facebook. So this is only on Facebook. So this kind of shows the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. There have been others. As we'll see, the use of social media and digital platforms to disseminate terrorist propaganda has been well documented, as have the efforts to use social media for recruitment and radicalization, right? So these are all connected issues that we will touch upon in this panel. Now, after Christchurch, what has happened is that this has led to a global outcry, and not only have there then been efforts to receiving something. Oh, excellent. Not only have there been efforts then by various governments to see what can be done to address this issue, which was actually manifested in something called the Christchurch Call. Some of you will be familiar with it, which calls and outlines a series of commitments by governments and companies to tackle this issue. But what we've also been seeing is efforts at the national level to regulate, to introduce regulation and legislation that will specifically targeted at intermediate reliability legislation and social media regulation, media platform regulation. So, last thing to say here before I introduce my panel is these efforts alone have demonstrated some of the challenges in dealing with this. And what is particularly problematic, as we've seen, is ensuring that in a rush to deal with a very real issue, because we all agree that we want to need to address challenges related to terrorist content, proliferation terrorist content, radicalization, and how it's affecting our society. The problem can be that in a rush to deal with these issues, what can happen is that fundamental principles such as human rights and the need to preserve a free, open, and secure internet can be undermined. And that's part of the problem that I would like us to discuss here this evening. Now I'll just briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll kick off the discussion. What I'd like to do is have 2 rounds of interventions by the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and we'll try and make it as interactive as possible. I can see all of you, so I will see if you're asleep or behind your phones. To my left, I have Dr. Gulshan Rai, the former National Cybersecurity Coordinator for India, now Distinguished Fellow with the ORF. To my right, Mr. Saad Mohseni, CEO and founder, right, of the Mobi Group. Now, I want to say it's based in Afghanistan, but I wasn't sure whether that was Dubai or not, or Kabul, but maybe he can clarify that later. To his right is Emerson Brooking, a resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. To our left, Ms. Marietje Schaake, the president of the Cyber Peace Institute and also a former member of the European Parliament. So without further ado, I'd first like to come to Dr. Rai to tell us a little bit about your experience of dealing with these issues in the Indian context.
Thank you, Kaspar, for giving me the opportunity to start the discussions there. I'll take 5 minutes, as you have said, and then we can go for the next things there. The issue relating to the hate speech or issue relating to radicalization or any terrorism content is not something which is happening now there. It has been happening for the centuries there. The only thing, the technology which has come up has complicated the issue, and that's why more focus has been done there. The technology is such a way that it can, from anywhere, can be posted, anywhere can be morphed, fake, and all kind of things are happening there. So technology has made a difference from the past few centuries to today in the way the radicalization and terrorism has happened there. And I was talking to her during the break that the India is facing the 2 type of a kind of a content problems there. One is the radicalization and the terrorism. And the second is the hate content which happened the civilian population, that aspect there. But some of the issues of the 2, the terrorism as well as the radicalization and the hate content has found a relationship together, and we have seen a number of cases where there is a combination, there is a connectivity happens there. The radicalization and the terrorism point of things in India, we have found again 2 type of things. One, the radicalization which is being used by the groups outside the country, rest of the world. They are mobilizing people from India to go and join them, such as ISIS as well as other groups there. And the terrorism we have seen from our neighborhood also, the next neighborhood that we have seen those terrorism cases which are distinct from the radicalization aspect, but though radicalization is happening from there. And the third and the other type of a thing, radicalization and the terrorism we have seen, where the civilian were connected, and it was more of creating the morph pictures and creating the fake contents there. Now, let me deal with the radicalization issues there, and I have personally dealt with those cases there, and I have seen again, if one is doing the radicalization, if it is happening in a normal manner, using the normal ways and means to technology, the issues are much simpler that can be handled there. Mm-hmm. But I've seen how the technology has been used in a complex manner to do the radicalization. And let me narrate one incident, and it's almost 2 years incident which I narrate that case there. One of the police officer in our one of the state, they brought the court order, and they said that this radical content should be brought down, court order, and I had to implement the court order. And I implemented the court order, but then in that court order, the 32 more websites were blocked. Mm-hmm. And one of the famous two of the famous websites were the GitHub, as well as a famous dictionary or the library, famous dictionary. Now, a lot of furore came up, a lot of noise came up, but what was there, the radicalization is happening, you're running a stream of the channel like you run on the TV footnotes there, on a dictionary kind of a websites, and to push the paste bin, and they use the GitHub and paste the material, and it vanishes after some time, it appears, vanishes after some time there. Such cases are being used. I mean, and it takes to another link there. Ultimately, with layers and layers, like you have the Tor system there in our technology. The layers are onion roots are there. They take you the layers and layers, and ultimately they take to the radicalization channel or the terrorism channel, where they push the information, say download over here there, and in both sides they use the Tor kind of another layer of the technology. They use the Tor. Such cases, and they are extremely radicalized kind of a thing. They teach you, they tell you, they do all kind of activity. I've seen those incidences there, and these other incidences, the terrorism we have seen across the border there, where, and that was largely we have seen in the northeast exodus which happened in the country, where 10,000 people from one city was migrating to another city. Railway tickets were being bought. Whole lot of our trains were clogged there, and those Rohingya Muslims and in the Burmas, and that kind of a thing happens there. We have seen that it's another example of terrorism aspect there. But then it also created a lot of riots there. The riots there. It was combination of the hate content and this. Now, to deal with such cases is extremely difficult, because today the position is slightly better, that the regulations may be coming up, and I must also acknowledge in the open forum that those were the initial days, and the service provider most of the time were outside India, based there. Some of them cooperated, some of them didn't cooperate. But today, that kind of a realization among those companies also is better. They are cooperating, working with the government, and we are trying to solve some of the cases there. But then today the issue is there is no definition of universal accepted definition of what is terrorism. That's what the main problem is there. And some sort of we need some sort of a understanding worldwide, at least in some of the issues, that how to deal with content which is a purely terrorism related content, or we do the radicalization, whether radicalization for religion A, religion B, religion C. Radicalization of any religion concerned with that is not desirable to do that. These are the big challenge, and these challenges are becoming more and more complex, in the sense that technology is also moving up, and with the AI coming up, big data coming up, the challenges have become more and more surmounted, and with the 5G coming up, higher bandwidth is available. You have videos running there, fake videos running there. Those issues have become much more complex. I mean, India is a democratic country. We don't have some of the countries have the surveillance system, or some of the technology control system at the gateway. We don't have that kind of a system there. And population is very, very large. You can see India is one of those countries where the social media users are very, very high. In fact, if you see 1/3 of the planet is covered by social media, out of 1/3, half of will be the 35% will be the Indians only in India also. It's a great challenge, and the solution, I think we need to be same challenge.
Save something for the second round.
Thank
We'll
you.
come to solutions, I promise, in a bit. But I'd like to keep us focused a little bit on what the problem is still. I think, thank you very much, Dr. Rai, for opening up some of the, I think what you've identified are some important trends here. One is this conflation of different types of content, and which brings us to the problem of then desegregating of how to deal with different types of content. The other is the role of intermediaries, and how the role of private companies plays a role in tackling this issue. I'd like to come to Mr. Morsali for the role of intermediaries, and how you see the trends from your perspective, and how do you see the role of a media company in this context?
Well, it depends on the market, and depends in terms of internet penetration and so forth. But the two examples I would give, obviously, are Afghanistan and Ethiopia, two countries we have operations in. And what's interesting is, in both countries, internet penetration is relatively low. But despite low numbers, in terms of access to Facebook and other social media platforms, we're seeing the danger signs in terms of the use of social media, not by terrorists, by establishment figures. For example, Ethiopia is on this ancient country, the birthplace of civilization, which unfortunately is an ethnic federation. There's a real risk of balkanization of this country of 120 million people, and you can, you can blame social media, and of course the politicians and the establishment figures who are fairly adept at using social media in terms of provoking the masses. We do what we can because we have mass media outlets in both these countries where there are single TV households and the families still gather around the TV set. But our hold over these people is becoming less and less powerful. We don't have the sort of hold we have on a monthly basis. In a place like Afghanistan, a third of the population has access to Facebook, but we think in the next 2 to 3 years, it'll be up to 100% of the population. And both these countries, ironically, their median ages are around 17 or 18. So they're fairly savvy. As soon as they get access to a mobile phone and they have bandwidth, they'll be able to go to a platform where they have their views reinforced. And you have to ask yourself the question, democracy in this new environment, does it actually work? Because you're in some ways you're allowing the mob to decide as to what happens. Now, we can talk about Islamic fundamentalism and radicalism and how they recruit online, but the scary thing is a country like Hungary or Poland and dozens of other countries where the democratic process is used by these radicals to come in, and they use social media in terms of provoking and enticing an entire population. And they're content not to be inclusive and to let the majority, 50 plus 1%, to just keep those people happy. So I think that the challenge is a lot bigger than terrorism. I think, and I think can you legislate in a democratic country? And the answer is no. And social and media organizations such as ourselves, yes, some of us feel responsible, but you look at the U.S. with Fox News, and you look at other outlets in other parts of the world. Provoking, it sells. It sells. Millions of people tune in for a fight, and people are unwilling or unable to think critically nowadays. We have not taught our kids to think critically. They go to a platform where their views are simply reinforced. So you have this echo chamber, and that's going to continue to divide, whether it's the U.S. or Afghanistan or Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, and I can see Maricha wanting to jump in there.
I can wait too, but...
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I was happy to see that it's not a discussion over kava, but a discussion over kalua. So I hope everybody is staying awake on that. I'm going to build a little bit on the discussion this morning, which also dealt with disinformation. And I just want to sort of slice a couple of the aspects of this discussion before we start. So I think, one of the starting points is the idea that laws should apply online as they do offline. But we easily see that that's easy to say and a principle that makes a lot of sense, but it's harder to implement because we have global companies that have terms of use that are established on the basis of one set of laws and principles, and then operate in multiple jurisdictions with different norms, different cultures, different sensitivities, different languages, et cetera, et cetera. But if we stick with the principle of laws applying when the rule of law exists, and those should also apply online, then you could say assessing which content fits within the law and which is illegal should be straightforward. beheadings, if expressions of violence are illegal, should not be kept. Child pornography or other kinds of illegal content should simply be taken down. And then if content is legal, it should stay up. And then there's probably a big gray zone in between, which we can talk about later. But radicalization, I think, is typically a very slippery slope, where we don't only see that the question of whether an expression falls within free speech or not is a challenge, but also that these groups that have an agenda to push, namely to recruit people or to polarize or to strip people away from supporting liberal democracy, they often know exactly how to walk a very fine line. So they will weigh their words very carefully as to be as rousing as possible, but still stay within the law. So I think it's really important to understand the tactics of people who are trying to, for example, recruit for terrorist networks, or to recruit for nationalist or Nazi groups, how they use words within the law that are still harmful in the bigger picture, and that can push people from words to deeds in the real world. Now, going to the role of companies, which have their own terms of use, which you could say are kind of the laws of their own platforms, which are not harmonized with human rights law, not harmonized with speech law necessarily, and in fact can go much further. Or they have discretion, so to say, to go further. And so what I think is interesting when we talk about the question of disinformation and speech online is that often people say, well, especially in America, where a lot of the big platforms are located, speech is protected, speech should be free. And I think that's not the only question we need to answer. I think there's a difference between somebody standing in a corner and saying, I love Hitler, or walking over to that person, giving them a megaphone and saying, hey, you want to meet some more people that are very sensitive to this theory that you're whispering there in a corner? Let me take you and show you the way. And in fact, there's a couple of other people, and to really actually help these people organize and amplify their voices through promoting, through amplifying, through micro-targeting exactly those people that may be sensitive, and then testing multiple messages on these people to see what sticks, and then to take them further and further along within these sort of rabbit hole type scenarios. So I think that this is a problem. Another problem is that we don't see law enforcement and governments necessarily using laws that exist to hold perpetrators first and foremost, but also the platforms that are perhaps not acting sufficiently to account. But in fact, they are asking of commercial companies with different incentives to take this responsibility upon them, basically outsourcing decisions about which content is legal and is not legal, asking companies to basically fix it in very vague terms. I think that's another problem where we see that actually it's not the law that's leading, but it is much more arbitrary, more invisible, less accountable decisions that are being pushed onto the platforms that often the platforms will take as an option short of legislative measures. So even though it may be increasingly uncomfortable for technology companies to have this responsibility, if it saves them from regulation, they may well go a long way in doing that. So I think this leads to less transparency and less accountability, very opaque. And as I mentioned this morning, and I want to stress it again, also no broader understanding of the bigger ecosystem of how information travels, of which tested messages may stick, of how much people pay to reach audiences, what is organic, why conspiracies are rising, why radical messages are reaching certain people, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, what it represents, whether accounts that we see are real. So in other words, does a message have a following that manifests itself in the real world, or is it an amplified notion of support that is actually unsubstantiated and organized by bots? So I think there's a lot of questions there in the relationship between companies and governments / the law and law enforcement. and a lot that we don't know about why things go viral, about what the impact of business models is, and why rabbit holes exist. So that is when we make a clear distinction between illegal and legal, and we haven't even touched upon questions of perfectly legal content but harmful content, or questions of, for example, anti-vaccination theories that may either be religiously informed, they may be commercially informed, but they show, and I think that this is often a helpful example, if we don't want to get into the very politicized discussions, they show that even if you can persuade a very, very small percentage of people to change their behavior, you can see children dying, you can see real life harm. And if we extrapolate this example to an imagination of politics or an imagination of violent behavior, then if we imagine that you equally have to only persuade a very, very small percentage of people, that there can easily be real world harms. And I think, and I mean like actual harms, so violence, hatred, etc., etc. So I always keep that in mind when I hear about another outbreak of measles, and it's really hard to explain from any medical background, except when people are increasingly persuaded not to vaccinate their children, and then when we see that the messages of anti-vaccinations for a variety of reasons end up rising to the top of all kinds of ranks online. So I actually still have more questions than answers, but I wanted to sort of slice it along a few fundamental principles before we get into the details.
Thank you, Moderator, for that. And I was really hesitant at the beginning to frame this discussion around harmful content. I run a human rights organization in the interest of full disclosure, and the word harmful can often be used to obfuscate, in a way, something that is completely legal, but people may see it as harmful. There, in terms of when we, so this is really a really important point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because if we're thinking about what is legal and illegal, harmful does not necessarily help as a term in helping us distinguish that. But I'd like us to come back to that in a bit. Emerson, I know you mentioned you wanted to discuss a little bit this trend about the convergence between technology and terrorism. Would you like to offer your thoughts on where we're going in terms of trends and emerging trends in particular?
I'd be happy to. So I think most people in this room are familiar with the general sketch of what unfolded in the Christchurch attacks. I wanted to talk about what I see as the future of this internet-driven digital terrorism, and talk about it through the lens of another attack that received a lot less attention, that happened a month after Christchurch, and one that I was in a position to study pretty closely. And this was an attack at a synagogue in Poway, California, that killed one person and was a copycat attack of Christchurch. And there was a 19-year-old from middle-class family, no history of violence. He pulls up to this California synagogue. Before he gets out of his car, he posts a manifesto to 8chan, same as the Christchurch terrorist had. He activates a live stream on a camera attached to his gun, but he's 19 years old, he's nervous, so he doesn't do it right. So the live stream never actually goes public. He enters the synagogue, and at some point after a conversation with someone at the front, he opens fire. He kills one person and injures two, but he quickly empties his clip, and he's too nervous to reload. The people in the synagogue, the victims, are able to reorganize, and then they rush him, and he flees. He gets back in the car, drives away. He's freaked out. He peacefully surrenders to police a few hours later. And copycat terrorist attacks are nothing new. Whenever we see a particular, especially a new novel form of violence, it's usually copied in sometimes other parts of the world. And usually the time frame is also pretty quick. Think about the Columbine school shooting in the US in '97. There was a cascade of copycat attacks that had essentially identical methods, all unfolding very quickly. So copycats are nothing new, but this attack is still really stuck with me. And it stuck with me because of the profile of the terrorist. Because, and the way it contrasts with the terrorist in Christchurch. as a terrorist in Christchurch, was well versed in white supremacist ideology, teachings, and research. He trained, conducted military-style drills for months in preparation for his attack. It was premeditated. He knew what he wanted to do and why he wanted to do it. This 19-year-old in this peaceful California suburb had no great convictions until he learned about the New Zealand attack. The reason he was driven to do what he did is that he fell into this small internet community that had emerged in the aftermath of the Christchurch attack, in which that terrorist was lauded as a hero. They had their own memes, their own jokes, and as he drew deeper into this community, he felt like the most important thing he could do in his life was to satisfy his new online friends. And that's why he did what he did. So this was not political or ideological or religious terrorism, although it had that veneer. Instead, it was just someone who felt like being part of this community and contributing to it mattered more to him than anything else. And I think it's illustrative of some of the principles of future digital terrorism. The fact that more and more we're going to see these sorts of micro-communities that emerge in the aftermath of incidents, where people are going to feel so emotionally bonded to them that they feel compelled to conduct acts of violence in the real world. I can think, for instance, of a number of conspiracy theory communities in the United States. You can range from the flat earthers to the QAnon folks, who are so deeply invested in that online community that they've severed all other ties. And even though that community is not particularly ideological, it's not hard to see them making the leap from participating in this community to conducting acts of violence on behalf of it. What's also demonstrated in the Poway, California attack is the durability of these terroristic communities. There was a huge international response in the aftermath of Christchurch. One thought that the platforms that these white supremacist terrorists used would have been pushed deep enough underground that they wouldn't be that easy to find, or that significant steps would have been taken to halt how quickly manifestos could circulate in the aftermath of these attacks. Significant steps had been done, and we'll talk about them, but the fact is you could still find that guy's manifesto if you want to. And it unfolded in many ways like Christchurch had. It was just the difference in the profile of the terrorist. And last, I want to emphasize the fact that as far as Americans go, this was the first member of Generation Z to conduct a terror attack on U.S. soil. And it wasn't Islamic-inspired terrorism. It was related, at least tangentially, to white supremacist ideology. Mm-hmm. So I think that also says a lot about the profile of digital terrorism as we go into the 2020s.
Thank you. Thanks, Emerson. I'd like to check in with the audience and see whether anyone has any reactions to the first round of interventions and take it from there. Could you please introduce yourself and make a comment or question?
I'm David Loyne. I'm an author. I'm at King's College London. I was a journalist for 35 years. The reviled mainstream media that I worked for, is reviled nowadays, is now looking like a model that really functions. And I pay tribute to Saad, who's brought public service values to Afghanistan, Iran, Ethiopia, the other countries he's worked in terms of bringing real journalism of the sort that we've done in the West and expected to do in the West for so long to countries that didn't have it. In the countries where we've done it because of regulation, and we've done it because we've been properly financed and properly taxed. And the internet companies, Facebook in particular, Google as well, have stolen first the journalism, and then they've stolen the business model. So they're stealing all the advertising from all the journalists all over the world and using the content that journalists, mainstream journalists, the reviled mainstream media provide. And so they're literally sucking the oxygen out of the room for true media and putting fake media online. And Marietta spoke eloquently this morning and tonight about regulation and law, but it's about taxation, isn't it? Don't we need to find an international summit that brings these companies together, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and tax them fully so that we can properly regulate them internationally and take the money from them that all the other media companies in the world have to pay for, so that they realize that they're publishers and not just providers of information.
Thank you very much for that. Is there anyone else who would like to? I see a couple of hands. I'll take them all and then we'll come back to the panel. A gentleman in the back first. Is there a microphone that we could do? Thank you.
I can yell.
If you could please introduce yourself and then
Sure.
Thank
I'm
you.
Terry Wolf. I'm the director of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. And I previously in the American system was the Deputy Special Envoy for the Coalition to Defeat ISIS. So I've looked at this, the things that you talked about, I've looked at in incredible depth, as you would well imagine. I guess the question really is, when are we going to get serious about this? And so what you have portrayed is things that we saw Daesh do, things that we saw occur at the Holy Bakery in terms of the use of technology and the adaption of extremists, things that Emerson just talked about with the left-wing side of the house in terms of that sort of, or the right-wing side of the house and that group of extremists. But the adaption of these groups are remarkable. So they are ahead of you. They are archiving everything they can. And so nations can knock them off the net temporarily. It will disrupt things, but the mediums are still there. And as our colleague just talked about, they are incredibly adaptable. And until we figure out how to put pressure on them in terms of the dollars that the social media companies can make, the social media companies will not adapt. And this medium, this domain will be useful to the extremists, whichever flavor you pick and choose. So just a thought, but what I'm interested in is, what do we do next? What do we do next? That's the question.
I promise we'll get to that
Thank you.
in a second. The lady in the back, and then do you mind first, and then I'll come to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather Graby from Open Society. So we've talked about the supply side, the people who are trying to push this kind of content. We've talked about the intermediaries, those who are providing the channels. And Marietje started to talk about the demand side. And that's what I'd like to know more about from the panel. How do you make citizens more resilient to radicalization? And that's a huge issue which we could go into. But I want to ask something very specifically, drawing on Marietje's example of vaccinations, which was not, as far as we can tell, any orchestrated disinformation by any particular body. It started as actually quite a grassroots movement, but it fed on mistrust. Mistrust of scientists and the medical profession, mistrust of government. And in fact, the more government denials about problems with vaccinations, the more the movement grew. And the more insistence by chief medical officers of various countries that vaccines are safe, the more that people look for evidence that they were not. So the demand side, it's easy to say, digital education, critical thinking, that's the answer. But what specifically would the different members of the panel who have a lot of different experiences recommend to make the general population somewhat less skeptical of science and somewhat more skeptical about what they read online?
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman here in the front.
Thank you. We, in a way, helped the first social media lab being set up in India with Mumbai police. And this was 7 years back. And over the 7 years, they have been able to preempt, I think, a lot of such kind of content and being able to remove that before it could cause law and order problems. So as we were helping them with some of the tools to kind of see such kind of content online and help in removing that content before the harm could be done, I think one of the key needs that was felt was for any law enforcement agency, forget the legal part, but for any law enforcement agency to preempt the use or rather the damage that such content can cause, some tools of predictive intelligence that can anticipate. I think we heard somebody from Facebook yesterday talk about what Facebook is doing to prevent some of these things online. But I think what are the kind of predictive tools and the artificial intelligence that will be used to preempt the harmful impact of these kind of content? The second part, I think what I would like to hear the panelists talk more about is not just defining the problem, but I think possibly some of the solutions around how do we really go forward more in terms of, we talked about the potential taxation and making these companies accountable. I think all that is happening, but in terms of, let's say, just the potential for the people who are, let's say, accountable for that content to be made, let's say, attributable in some way. So how do we make attribution of that content becoming, and especially from the not just the individuals but the state actors, because we saw a lot of state actors' role being played in distribution of these harmful content.
Okay, thank you. I know there are a couple of other hands, but I'd like to now change the focus a little bit, and thank you very much for all of your interventions, because I think they bring us closer to that and the discussion about what do we do about this. Just before we go there, I do want to note that I've been hearing a lot of different types of framing of the problem, and I think it's quite difficult, and we only have like 15 minutes left to discuss this. But from my experience, dealing with an issue like disinformation and dealing with an issue of hate speech online and dealing with an issue of terrorist content online are not going to have the same solutions. I think it is important that we are specific about what we're talking about, just for the purpose of, so whatever the topic that you're addressing, when I ask you about solutions, if you can just be specific what it is that we're talking about when you say this, what do we do about this, to help us frame a little bit. So with that, I mean, we've heard now already a couple of really interesting ideas. We've heard in terms of solutions, taxation, regulation, technological AI, technology helping us predict some of the harms. I'd like to now turn to the panel to see what your thoughts are on this. What do we do? And before I do, and also just to say, for instance, in the Christchurch call, there are a number of commitments and a range of options to deal with these, and some of them, and the first one actually is building resilience. So to the point that the lady in the back made about the need for education, whether we're talking about terrorist content online or whether we're talking about disinformation, education seems to be a cornerstone of everything that we need to be the starting point for how we deal with the issues we're talking about. Marietje, could I come to you first for your thoughts on what do we do about the problem?
Yeah,
however
my
you
drawing
define
on
it.
this small
Yes.
paper is getting bigger and bigger, but I'm just going to say a few things, and then hopefully we can continue the conversation informally. What I think is really important to pick up from also what Emerson said about the synagogue attack, which there are more and more of those incidents. There's actually someone who was equally inspired by 8chan and 4chan who murdered a mobster who seemed invincible, but not because he was a mobster, but also because in the mind of this person he was like some actor in a conspiracy. So we really see people that are picking up on that, and I think the crux of the matter is, how can people who are ill-intended find these vulnerable people? Because I mean, we probably think that however many theories and HM messages we would see, we may never be persuaded. But the question is, who are those very, very few individuals that are, and how come they are matched almost to perfection, just like the advertisements maybe, or the dates on platforms like Tinder, of the exact profile. And so this is where I think we have to look also when we want to think about resilience. How do you protect those people basically against themselves, right? Because again, if it's only a small percentage of people, those events, and this is what I wanted to get at, a murder case like that, a terrorist attack like that, on a synagogue, on a mosque, on a gay club, on people in general, creates new fear, creates a new trending topic on social media, creates a new opportunity to sow division. So it's almost like a domino of multiple layers of impact, right? You have deaths and the radicalization and creation of a new hero that maybe can then inspire another person. And there's beginnings of learning from that. For example, also in how media report. Initially, there was much more of a search for who was the perpetrator. Mention the name, who was he, try to find Facebook profiles, try to spread pictures. Now, I think there's a code among a number of media who are focusing more on the victims, really not glorifying the perpetrator, not giving the person a hero's kind of treatment, because some people, in the way that they are wired, they are unfortunately looking for that kind of glorification. And so I think there are lessons that are being learned there, but it's interesting. You can also see this kind of sensitizing with topics like suicide, where if you refer to suicide a certain way, it may trigger, and if you refer to it in much less explicit terms, it may dampen those triggers for people who are so inclined. But what I also pick up from that is that it's important to understand what the goals are of those actors, let's say, who are trying to sow this mistrust and are trying to prey on this mistrust. Because I'm increasingly convinced, and there's also some interesting research on this, that the goal may not be to convince of one theory or another, but to simply erode the general trust in society, to turn people away from elections, to turn people away from authorities, to turn people away from the media. I have friends who are, I believe, very, very sensible. They're highly educated. They are not suffering in their daily lives, and they tell me, I don't watch the news anymore. I don't know what to believe anymore. I am fed up with hearing all those negative messages, and so these are just anecdotal examples of people turning their backs. And obviously, in a democracy, participation is the key ingredient. So if citizens stop participating, step by step, little by little, that is quote unquote success for those who want to erode liberal democracy. So I think if you want to look at resilience, it's important to know where you're starting. I know the European Union better than other areas in the world, but even within the European Union, there are massive differences in trust in the system, trust in institutions, trust in the media. And the basic starting point of trust turns out to be very important for resilience. Also against disinformation, for example. So I think that's important. Now, I've heard the gentleman who used to be a journalist talking about taxation. There are a number of things that have to change, and we're trying to focus here on what's already a difficult topic, namely illegal content, terrorist content versus harmful and legal content, and the slippery slope between. We could talk about the entire ecosystem, about antitrust, about liability, about taxation, about protecting children, which I think is an important point, about mental health that is impacted by the addictions to being online, the kind of triggers that are fueled by being online. So there's a lot more that can be discussed. The right to privacy, obviously a very important point. And I suspect that a mix of these, for example, more choice of platforms and tech products that you can use, so that if you don't think that any of the big platforms dealt well with, let's say, the synagogue murder, that you can switch, which now is effectively not possible. The price of punishing the companies for bad behavior is still too high in the calculation of a lot of people. So there is no sort of magic wand. I'm sure otherwise somebody would have already presented it with great success, but it is going to require multiple chains that are linked together, that are going to slowly build this, or hopefully quickly build this resilience. But the one thing I'll conclude with is that this notion that it is up to citizens to make their choices, it is up to internet users to be better educated, can only go so far, because the asymmetry in power between an individual internet user and multi-billion-dollar companies is just too large. So I think we have to, in our solutions, not only look at preparing citizens, although I think it's an important element. There, I don't think we can expect them to oversee everything, to have the information to make well-informed choices, and some people will simply be more vulnerable than others, no matter how well we educate them.
Thank you. Just conscious of time, so I just want to let people know that we started a little bit late, so we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. So I would just encourage all the speakers to kind of keep their interventions short, so we get the audience involved as well. Sad, what do you think about the role of the media in all this? Marietje mentioned it. There's also in the Christchurch call to specific commitments or encouraging media how to deal with these sorts of incidents. What would you say the role of the media in helping us build resilience and dealing with this issue is?
Well, there's only so much we can do. I mean, I think I'm very pessimistic. I think there's not much we can do in terms of well, we can self-regulate. Outlets like us, we can self-regulate, but the market is going to become increasingly more and more fragmented, and user-generated content today attracts hundreds of millions of views on YouTube and so forth, for all ages, for kids, how to make dollhouses, and for adults in terms of news and commentary or blogs. We have a hold over our populations of, say, Ethiopia and Afghanistan because they're just a little bit behind. Now, Ethiopia is auctioning 2-3 more licenses. It's going to have lots of bandwidth, lots of internet. Same for Afghanistan. We're not going to have this hold over the audiences in the years ahead. The problem is, and Emerson mentioned this young man who went to the mosque and the other one who went to the synagogue, that these ideas, whether it's in the Middle East in terms of Islam and using the most extreme version of Islam, or in Europe with sort of a sanitized version of what those people are thinking in terms of anti-Semitic views and so forth, are becoming mainstream. I mean, how do you expect some of these European countries, which have extreme right-wing parties in power, to legislate, to deprive themselves of the opportunity to whip up this frenzy and to get it back into office? I mean, who knows, in 10 years, the majority of European countries may have governments that will use these platforms to stay in power. So I think the reason I feel depressed is because I don't think you can legislate. I think taxation may be a way, but it's not going to stop people from posting things. And don't forget that people are going to be always ahead of the legislators and the regulators and the authorities. I think we also have to discuss human nature. It's how easy it is to provoke.
No cure for that, Saad, I'm afraid.
Well, education is an important thing. You talked about, this lady talked about inoculating kids. We've worked with the Gates Foundation for many years in UNICEF on polio eradication in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's swimming against the tide. The best we've done is not go backwards. And we've done everything. We've thrown everything we've had. Media, using the religious establishments, education, and so forth. It's difficult to change people's mindsets. People are naturally conspiratorial. Not just the Afghans and the Pakistanis where we operate, but also people in the US, right? So I don't have any concrete plans except to say, expect things to get much worse.
Doom and gloom, great stuff.
Yeah.
Great stuff for this late in the evening, I love it. And luckily there's drinks later if people want it. But I think, can we talk a little bit about legislation and regulation? I mean, you say that I've heard a number of people being skeptical about regulation that's not going to deal with the problem. However, we are seeing in a number of countries, legislation is being developed. And in the past, I mean, legislation has been a way of dealing with part of the issue, if not all of it. It's perhaps too early to say, but the laws like the German NetzDG law are showing some promising results. At least that's what the German government says, but that's something to consider as well. So let's not throw away legislation. I know that the industry not so keen on that, but what else is there? Dr. Rai, what are your reflections on that? Especially from an Indian perspective, what do you do?
No, I say we also have a legislation, but I mean, what India can, what does it, what European does it, I don't think that situations are much different there. I mean, I can tell you one incident when we put some legislation, regulation in 2011, we said within 36 hours it has to be taken down. But I mean, entire world were pouncing on us. Why 36-hour companies were pouncing on us? Now, today I see the European countries are asking 24 hours. Germany has 24 hours there. I was in the UN meeting when the Prime Minister of the UK, she took a meeting. I was nearby that. I saw that. I think the takedown is not a solution because technology has created a different kind of a scenario. The whole problem is a creation of a virtual technology, a technology-led kind of a problem is there. So in my view, the technology has to play a role in prevention to a large extent of this problem there. Rules, regulation, legislation will play a role, will have to be there to prevent it there. But The one thing is very clear that legislation rules what we have seen in some of the country like Singapore or China or some other countries there. Their situations are different. Singapore cannot be compared with India or larger kind of a populations there. China can be prepared India, but then our political systems are different there. So rules, regulation, legislation had to be there, but let us understand that the technological innovations are happening so fast, rules, regulation cannot change so fast there. It takes time in the parliament system, democratic, or maybe or maybe any other system like China. It doesn't move so fast there. In a democracy, certainly doesn't pass there. The other problem is that the virtuality need to be matched interface with the reality there. Laws are in the real, we talk about the real and what technology is virtual. It's not that easy to deal with. While I don't say that regulation, legislation should not be there, they are one of the components, but in my view, predominantly, technology has to come forward and play a role along with the awareness and education there. I mean, country like India with 1.3 billion people, there is a limit up to which you can go, government can do, create the awareness and that part because the things are there. But I think predominantly I will give the awareness, technology-led solution should be account for 60% of the role. 20% can be legislation aspect, we need to be there. But more than that, I'll just give me 1 minute. I think our friend, he raised the issue. We need to divide the problem, break the problem into parts there. Terrorism and radicalization in one thing which every country has been impacted there. Let us divide the problem, and I liked your idea when you were interacting informally with us outside, that let us divide the problem into 3 phases there. Take the radicalization and the terrorism one aspect, take the pure hate content, let us take the second aspect there. The hate content, my friend, what he said, the government could be there. I agree with that aspect there. But the terrorism radicalization, let us develop a uniform kind of a understanding, uniform kind of a regulations, understanding regulation, maybe through the UN or other kind of a norms of behavior. Let it be part of that defined definition of terrorism. The social media should understand that these are the guidelines they need to follow and they remove it. And I mean, it's very difficult. Technology is changing so fast. Recognition system may fail them, but still, I mean, we can do some 70%, 80% they can do. So define the broader guidelines, divide into first handle terrorism and radicalization, devise the method, list down the method, let it be accepted universally, we should do universally acceptance there, and then deal with this hate content.
Thank you very much. And Emerson, just on to you for your solution. What's your silver bullet? And I'm going to have to say that we're really close to the end and we're running out of time. So I think I'm going to see if we can wrap up in the next 5 minutes. But Emerson, what are your thoughts here?
Sure. So we had a distinguished Indian and U.S. counterterrorism experts ask about specific solutions, specific actions we can take, and I wanted to talk about one of them. In the aftermath of the Christchurch attack, New Zealand government, at a period of reflection, assessed what had happened in that attack and what the greatest points of vulnerability and failure had been. They took actions regarding gun availability, and of course they strengthened their own monitoring. But one of the biggest points of failure had been the fact that the live stream video of the attack had gone viral. New Zealand government hadn't had anyone that they could reach out to on the technology company's side to tell them to stop it. Twitter and Facebook didn't have a publicly listed phone number for terror attacks, and it had been hours before they could get in contact with someone, which is unacceptable for a sovereign government that's trying to control the fallout of a major terror attack. So that was the origin and inspiration for the Christchurch Call. And we know the Christchurch Call is a list of non-binding principles to which different actors commit themselves, but Christchurch Call also now forms the basis of new, basically, communications mechanisms, which are activated in the event of a terror attack, in which there's elevated coordination between communications departments of different governments, And there's also elevated communication between tech companies and monitoring of this information environment. Pardon me. These protocols went into effect 3 or 4 months ago, and they were first activated with an attack in Halle, Germany, on a mosque, another attempted live stream attack, which fortunately was managed before anyone was killed, and also the content was immediately removed from online space. There are now new communications mechanisms in place where tech company sees a potential bit of content going viral that's terroristic in nature, a government gets in contact, they begin to have these conversations much more quickly. And then I had the opportunity just last month to go to Wellington, New Zealand, and help New Zealand government and the Christchurch call participants basically war game their systems and figure out how to improve them further. But I want to end by identifying a few challenges is they have built this more robust coordination mechanism. The first is that government and technology companies still have profoundly different definitions of what a crisis entails. Something that I really pushed these participants on was when there's a perspective crisis, when there's elevated rhetoric, when there are non-specific threats of a future terrorist action, that's a crisis if you're a counter-terrorist operator in the government. That's not really a crisis for technology companies because there's no discrete thing that they can act on. And they could call it a crisis in general terms, but that means they would perpetually be in crisis response mode, which then renders crisis response mode useless because it's no different from the normal state of affairs. Second is that large technology companies do have the resources and are now devoting the bandwidth to be perennially responsive to these terrorist attacks. That's not the case for smaller technology platforms. They don't have the resources. Sometimes they don't have the will, but often it's resource limitations that keep them from developing this rapid response in the event of a terror attack. There are no laws that govern how many hundreds of millions of users your service has before you have to sit down and have a serious conversation about terrorist exploitation. Even as Facebook, Twitter, and those sorts of companies get a firmer grip on this, terrorists are going to be turning to new platforms that don't have those same infrastructure in place. And finally, even as technology companies and governments are working together to create better response mechanisms to future terror attacks, the fact is that these response mechanisms very much affect speech in the global commons and national level speech. But at least right now, there has not been enough conversation, and people aren't sure how to adequately involve the public. We're getting better at counterterrorism response online, but there's still no democratic accountability involved in it. And I think that will be the biggest challenge as we go into the years ahead.
Thank you, Emerson. And on this note, I'm so sorry, and I want to apologize to everyone who hasn't had a chance to talk. Unfortunately, we've come to the end, and we're already over time by 10 minutes. I encourage people who want to engage to come speak to the panelists after the session. I'm not going to try and summarize anything, just to say that it sounds like the problem is multifaceted, so is the solution. But I appreciate Emerson's intervention, and I think it allows us to say that there is still hope, and there are things that we can do that are effective, at least part of the solution, right? And just one point that I was asked to make, just for everyone's awareness, about the session tomorrow. That it begins at 9:30 for everyone's own, and that the newly appointed CDS will be joining us as well. So just so that everyone is aware of that. And on that note, I'd like to invite all of us to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists and all of you as well. Thank you.